Alright, I'm recording this earlier because the last 2 editions I released halfway through the month, and hopefully I can release this one closer to the start of the month. Let's jump straight into it. The first movie I watched in March was The Color of Pomegranates. I was visiting Melbourne and I managed to catch 3 movies in the cinema. This is an Armenian film made almost 60 years ago. It documents the life of an 18th century Armenian poet and musician called Sayat Nova. This movie portrays the events in his life from childhood up to his death, visually and poetically, rather than literally. I can't stress that enough. This is visual poetry in its purest form, and it's often nonsensical, but deeply embeds itself into the subconscious of this man. The director, Sergei Parajanov, was inspired by the Armenian illuminated miniature, and he said that he wanted to create that inner dynamic that comes from inside these pictures. I think he very much succeeded here, and the images hold such rich and complex meaning that I'm sure can be interpreted in any number of ways. This is one of the most unique and psychedelic cinema experiences I've ever had. Nothing really makes sense on the screen. The images are so poetically, religiously, and politically charged. In fact, the Russian government had this heavily edited before release and had the name changed from Sayat Nova to The Color of Pomegranates because they deemed this to have nothing to do with the poet's life. And so that's kind of what type of movie we're talking about here. I've never ever seen something quite like it before. The next movie I watched was Holy Motors by Leo Carax. This film was just an absolutely wild, overwhelming, and gargantuan movie. It doesn't just break genre conventions, it breaks storytelling and even filmmaking conventions entirely. Wikipedia describes this film as a surrealist fantasy drama film, but I'd say this would just be scratching the surface. To be honest, the less you know about it, the better this becomes. Here's the opening sentence of the plot. A man wakes up and finds a secret door in his hotel room. He opens it and wanders into a movie theater full of sleeping patrons. A naked child and several dogs wander the aisles. Yeah, that's kind of the territory we're talking about here. This is another completely unique film that literally takes you on an unforgettable ride. I felt like my emotions were like paints on a palette being swished around constantly throughout the film, and I had an absolute blast with this. The next film was a part of the same Carax season held at the Melbourne Cinematheque. I believe this is Leo Carax's debut feature film. This was called Boy Meets Girl, and this is the start of the creative partnership with Denis Lavant, who has featured in almost all of his movies since this one. And Carax himself says that he sees Lavant in his movies almost as an extension of himself. This is clearly inspired by the French New Wave of the 50s and 60s. For me, sometimes the inner dialogues of characters in these films do drive me a bit nuts. The French just love to yap. There's a lot of meandering, but it all does serve a purpose though, and it ends up being a melancholy story about these 2 broken protagonists and finding meaning and connection, culminating in a very chilling ending. Next, I watched The Long Voyage Home. This film is directed by John Ford, who is considered one of the most influential filmmakers during the golden age of Hollywood. This film also stars John Wayne, who was one of, if not the biggest star during this era of Hollywood as well, with a career spanning nearly 5 decades and across just under 200 movies. Despite all this, The Long Voyage Home is not one of John Ford's most well-known works. The film is a relatively straightforward story following a group of sailors returning home from the West Indies during World War II. The film mainly focuses on this group and the dynamics within it, exploring themes of masculinity, trauma, and paranoia, especially during this time period. Unfortunately, a lot of the dialogue was hard to follow at times, meaning I couldn't fully grasp everything happening. However, the incredible lighting and camera work is considered a precursor to the film noir aesthetic. You can definitely see so many hints of brilliance from Greg Toland, which we'd later see in Citizen Kane. Speaking of, the next film I watched in the same session was Citizen Kane itself. If you've ever searched up the greatest films of all time, this film is usually near the top or at the top in almost every single one of these lists. Objectively impossible to have a quote-unquote greatest film of all time, but to be honest, after seeing Citizen Kane, I definitely get it. I'm so glad that I waited all of these years to watch this in a cinema, because I can assure you that watching this at home would be a completely different experience. The movie follows the rise and fall of a newspaper magnate, Charles Foster Kane, played by Orson Welles himself. The film begins with the character's death, and so begins the infamous retelling of the story of Charles Foster Kane from birth till death. I don't have time to break down the infamous lore surrounding the production of this movie, including a contract with complete creative control given to a 26-year-old Orson Welles, which was absolutely unheard of at the time, let alone for someone who hasn't even made a feature film before. Here is an excerpt of a press statement issued by Welles before the film released. There have been many motion pictures and novels rigorously obeying the formula of the success story. I wish to do something quite different. I wish to make a picture which might be called a failure story. Even from that one quote, you can tell that he was a true visionary, and he went and did it, entirely revolutionizing storytelling and filmmaking. For 40 years, Citizen Kane stood at #1 in the British Film Institute's Sight and Sound Decennial poll. As mentioned earlier, Greg Toland's cinematography is just beautiful and serves the story so well. Orson Welles' directing, you just could not tell that this was his first ever film. For over 80 years, this film has been discussed, and I don't think I can add any more superlatives to just how monumental this film really is. If you haven't ever seen Citizen Kane, make sure the next time it's playing in a cinema, you go and grab a ticket for it, because it genuinely changes the way you see how stories are told. The next movie that I watched was Stranger on the Third Floor. This film is considered one of the first true noirs. If it wasn't the first one, it's definitely a pioneer of the genre. That style of filmmaking was very unheard of at the time. The story is very simple. It follows a man called Michael, who is a newspaper reporter. After witnessing a murder, fears that his evidence has condemned the wrong man to die. At first, Michael is very happy. Because of his story, he's gotten a big raise at work, he's popular there, and he can now afford to propose to his fiancée as well. But as the film progresses, he becomes more and more guilty, fearing that he is testified against the wrong man. The film is the strongest when it delves into the surreal dream sequences of Michael. It is very reminiscent of The Trial, which I watched in January. This definitely served as an inspiration, and again, the lighting and camera work here was brilliant for its time. Next, I watched The Godfather. This is of course an absolute classic. It is also consistently up there with the greatest films of all time, and I watched this probably over a decade ago, so it was interesting to see what scenes I remembered and which scenes I didn't. There were actually a lot of memorable scenes which I actually completely forgot, but there were also insignificant scenes that I had such vivid memories of, so that was really interesting. This film is as good as its reputation is. It's not perfect, it's definitely got some weird pacing and underwritten characters, but what is on the screen is just an absolute delight. I know Marlon Brando is constantly given his flowers for his amazing performance as the Godfather, but for me the absolute highlight had to be Al Pacino and his transformation throughout the movie. On this viewing, I noticed that although the women in the film played side characters and are mostly in the background, they actually play significant roles in the film. The mafia can use all the violence and lies to force things to go their way, but no matter how much deception or violence is used, they are the one constant that the men cannot control. I think the final shot is very deliberately placed and completely recontextualizes the role of women in this film and can change how you experience this film if you focus on their perspectives. The next movies I watched were Anti-Cosmos, Imagination, and Space Noise. I guess March is just the month for unique cinema experiences. This one might just top them all. These three movies, if you could even call them that, are three works of art from Japanese artist Takashi Makino. He was also on stage performing the music through the pictures on the screen. In this respect, I would say it's closer to exhibits than films. Makino had said that when he was 5 or 6 years old, he would turn on the TV just to watch the TV noise, and it was up to him to decide which direction the image was moving and to project his own images onto the screen because all there was the visual noise. This is the type of sensation that he tries to recreate in his own works. To give you an idea of Takashi's experimental approach, he once used physical elements like water and metal and mixed it with visual footage ranging from the sky all the way to wartime propaganda images. He would mix all of these elements and then blast light into it, and then he would project that onto a screen. So the first film, Anti-Cosmos, which Makino dedicated to his hard-of-hearing friend, was almost an out-of-body experience. Makino played a soundtrack which produced frequencies mostly below 1000 kilohertz, which physically vibrate the viewer's body. The third film, Space Noise, is actually one of his classics, which he's been performing for decades in over 100 countries. We wore those old cardboard 3D glasses, and it adds an extra layer to the already deeply layered artwork. Along with the ominous droning but strangely comforting soundtrack, the best way I could describe it was rushing through space at the speed of light. Sometimes an image resembling something familiar might appear, but it goes away just as quickly. After the films, I actually got to speak with him for almost half an hour, and I got to learn a lot about his inspirations, his approach to making these films, and also just his philosophy on life. It was a fascinating chat, and he's a very cool dude. And I also got the Space Noise cassette off him, which was really cool. This is like one of the coolest film collectibles I have now. Next, I watched The Man Who Sleeps. Unfortunately, I was the man who slept. This is the most French movie of all French movies, but actually it was played in English with an amazingly soothing narration by Shelley Duvall, and that combined with how tired I was completely knocked me out. I was only asleep for like 15 minutes, but it's not a long film, it's around 70 minutes, so I definitely missed some parts of it. The film follows an unnamed protagonist who starts feeling increasingly alienated and hopeless as we delve into the inner workings of his mind. He chooses to withdraw from the world, and from there we no longer know what's real or not, or whether there is a separation at all. The ambiguity of that dissonance adds to the nihilism of it all and makes us question our role in society and our own psyche. There's a line in the film that mentions being a rat trapped in a maze with no escape. And that's exactly how the film makes you feel, both within the narrative but potentially our own lives as well. This is definitely one of those right place at the right time kind of movies that I can see someone completely connecting with. And it's really fascinating given how sparse the story actually is. I could definitely see myself checking this out in French again as well. The next film I watched was Série Noire. For my last video and this one, I've written a few notes for each movie, but when I was scribbling them down for this one, I ended up writing an entire review because this film was amazing. The title was originally the name of a French publisher of dark detective novels, which later became a generic term for the genre itself. To name your film after an entire genre is bold, to say the least, but this film more than justifies the audacity. It features one of the most astonishing acting performances I've ever seen, and it genuinely blew me away. The film is about a down-on-his-luck door-to-door salesman, Franck, played by Patrick Dewaere, who meets a young girl who's been made a prostitute by her own aunt. Their encounter draws him into a situation that slowly unravels itself and reveals a deeper darkness both within the characters and the world around them. The physicality of Dewaere's performance is remarkable. He plays an incredibly complex character, frantic, anxious, and pathetic, yet somehow still sympathetic, endearing, and even funny, all the while keeping him grounded and believable. The opening scene alone, in which he dances in shadow boxes by himself, immediately establishes him as the film's central force who holds together this delicate tonal balance. The movie is scattered with these hilarious moments, but they never drown out its very bleak undertones. There's an anecdote about Patrick coming home after shooting a murder scene in a complete daze. When he was asked what was wrong, he replied with, "Do you realize that I killed someone today? It's not nothing to kill someone." This really sums up his dedication to the role, but unfortunately the lines between fact and fiction were very muddled, making this film even more disturbing. He struggled with his own tragic past and mental health, and he took his own life only a few years later. The actress Marie Trintignant also sadly died due to domestic violence later in her life, and it just makes what happens in this film so much more haunting. Overall, I think this is a masterpiece that deserves a far wider audience. Next, I managed to watch my last Best Picture nominee film, which was Train Dreams. I'll be honest, this one was not it. This felt like another tailor-made Netflix production to be easily digestible and be a crowd pleaser that hits all the right notes. Although this was more enjoyable than Frankenstein, it really fails to do anything more for me. At times, it genuinely felt like an AI-written movie. For my review on Letterboxd, I sarcastically wrote an AI prompt that I would have used to write this movie. By all accounts, this is not a bad movie. It has a clean script, it has clean performances, clean cinematography. You know where I'm headed here. That's exactly what the problem is here. This is what annoys me even more than a messy, poorly written, poorly shot film that at least tried. These are safe options that the studio knows will get great reviews and have people raving about it, but fails to actually challenge viewers or inspire any art. It represents a larger trend in the industry that I myself am very cynical about. Big studios pumping out safe bets and giving risky movies that reach for something more, even less of a chance than they already have. The next movie I watched was The Voice of Hind Rajab. This harrowing movie retells the true story of Hind Rajab, a 5-year-old Palestinian girl who was killed in the Gaza Strip. She was stranded in her car for hours with her entire family dead inside. The film recreates the situation in the call center of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society and uses the actual voice footage from Hind Rajab's call with them. Obviously, this was a very distressing film, but incredibly important and relevant. The moment I heard her voice in the film, I couldn't hold back the tears. It was unrelenting, leaving you feeling completely helpless and horrified. Above all else, this is still happening right now. May Hind Rajab rest in peace. On the same night after Hind Rajab, as if I wasn't traumatized enough, I watched The Piano Teacher. I don't think you could have chosen a more mentally exhausting double feature on a Monday night, but I am so glad I stayed for this because this was incredible. This film has a notorious reputation for being a really f***ed up movie from one of cinema's most infamous directors, Michael Haneke. I already went into this with the mentality of protecting myself, putting my seatbelt on. I was quite mentally drained already. It still didn't prepare me nearly enough for what a force of nature this film was. It wasn't because it was truly that messed up, and to be honest, I was expecting something outrageously horrendous because of its reputation, but rather it is genuinely one of the most emotionally confronting films in the best way possible. There's some very deep moral probing and just utter coldness without any moments of respite or time to breathe. He confronts you with what's on screen without any emotional manipulation. When there is any sort of music, it's from within the film, and it serves its purpose so well, playing each note with a calculated perfection. I don't think any actress in the world could have pulled off what Isabelle Huppert does here, one of the most groundbreaking performances of all time. Her co-star and herself won Best Actor and Actress at Cannes respectively, and it's truly deserved. It would just be impossible for any other filmmaker to make this movie. It's truly one for the ages. Next, I watched Portrait of a Lady on Fire. I know this one is cited as a modern masterpiece. Unfortunately for me, it didn't really click, which was surprising because on paper this is everything I really dig. Doomed romances with great dialogue and also very pretty. For me, it felt a little too calculated and too clean, almost sterile. The passion feels a little manufactured. The lighting, the sets and actresses are a little too perfect. That's a compliment, but also a reason why it didn't work for me. Instead of a wildfire, we get a controlled burning. I think the Euryclides allegory was a little too on the nose. It felt like a perfect script that was made to be analyzed in a film class instead of actually felt. I just didn't emotionally connect with the story like so many others did. The next movie I watched in a cinema was Project Hail Mary. This was a perfectly fine movie. I think Ryan Gosling in family-friendly mode is not my favorite Ryan Gosling. I think he is an amazing actor. He has a lot of range that people don't know him for. But unfortunately, post Barbie, it feels a little bit like he is selling out for safer, higher paid projects. And this is a film that feels exactly like one. Who am I to blame him? I'm not accusing him of taking this path. It's just personally sad for me because I would love to see him in more projects like those. The movie is a little strange because the only thing to latch onto really is the central dynamic between his character and Rocky, which is clearly what carries the film. But it's also confusing because it tries to introduce other elements that never quite work. There's a global conflict and countries working together, not really explained. Grace's backstory and struggles with love, mentioned in a single line, I believe. The side characters, yeah, not really written at all. So it ends up pulling the tone all over the place and doesn't really land on both its feet. Despite all this, there are still fun moments and one or two cool sequences to see on a big screen. Very much a watch and forget, and it's nowhere close to any of the sci-fis that this film has drawn comparisons to. The next film I watched was called The Spook Who Sat by the Door. This is an extremely rare film that was meant to be shown in the Gallery of Modern Art back in November of 2025. In fact, the only proper copy of this was held in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. When the US government shut down for 43 days back in November, it couldn't get sent over. Since I wasn't in the city at the time, I probably would never have been able to see this in my whole life. Which means Donald Trump himself has quite literally changed the movies I've watched in my life. Crazy to say. The story behind this movie is equally as fascinating. It was seen as a dangerous film at the time, and when it got released, the FBI started strong-arming cinema owners to take it down. Within a very short period of time, this film became an urban legend, only existing in bootleg copies and rumors. Even the cast and crew themselves said that they weren't able to watch their own movie in a cinema. The film is about the first black CIA agent who used what he learned in the CIA to start his own revolution against the government. With everything going on in America right now and in the last few decades, it feels just as relevant today as it did back then. Next, I watched Miami Vice. This movie is based off the original TV show. When it got released, it was not received well. However, it has since developed a cult following, and I can totally see why. This is a super messy movie that is the absolute pinnacle of the mid-2000s. It literally begins with Linkin Park and Jay-Z's mashup of Numb/Encore. It's cheesy, it's not particularly well written, and it's shot completely on digital. One of the first major studio films to have done so, not with particularly positive results either. But I think these are exactly the reasons why it's seen differently 20 years later. It just doesn't look like any other movie. For me, what I really like about this is that there are no heroes to root for or villains to root against. It's this dog-eat-dog world where some semblance of love and hope, even when it's inevitably doomed, gives us glimpses of humanity and beauty. I might be the first person to ever compare Miami Vice to A Portrait of a Lady on Fire, but I do think both films revolve around this doomed romance. And while Miami Vice is so much messier, more cheesy and melodramatic, it's the imperfections and the raw feelings on the screen which I think are the reasons why I prefer Miami Vice over Portrait of a Lady on Fire. It's fitting that the last film for this month was directed by the same director as the first film of this month, and it was called Andriesh. This is Sergei Parajanov's debut film, which he co-directed with Yakov Bazalian. The cinema here in Brisbane is doing a whole retrospective of his films, and if you remember from The Color of Pomegranates, I watched that over in Melbourne. It just goes to show how important and relevant his work is to this day. The film tells the tale of the young shepherd Andriesh, who dreamed of becoming a knight, and the fight against the evil wizard Black Whirlwind, who hates everything living. Seeing fairy tales told from the lens of different cultures is such a treat. And they aren't so different from the fantasy tales that I grew up with, whether that be Narnia or the Studio Ghibli films. At the same time, it also has its own unique charms and themes. My friend who I met at the cinema, who's a senior lady, had such a big smile on her face after the film, and it really made me appreciate the film so much more, because I could see that it also transported her back to her own childhood. It was really a touching moment. It was such a sweet tale of being brave, and also reminded me a little bit of The Alchemist, which also follows the journey of a shepherd boy. She then introduced me to her other friend after the session, and she suggested that this film was an allegory for Stalin, who instilled so much paranoia and suffering throughout the Soviet Union, and also paralyzed the land and its peoples throughout the 40s. Although he's never explicitly political, the defiance of Parajanov's art is on full display here, using art as a resistance to despair and terror. Alright, so that was everything I watched in March, and that was a lot of films. If I have another month where I watch the same amount, I might actually skip some of the movies. There are a few films where I just have a few thoughts and that's it, and I'd rather use the runtime of these videos to talk about the films I really want to talk about. Or else these videos will end up being half an hour long, and also I will have to do so much more recording and editing. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if you've seen or are interested in any of these movies, and I'll see you all in May. Ciao!